Imagine a world without writing. No books to read, no laws to follow, no stories passed down except through the fragile threads of memory. Life would feel like a dream that slips away each morning, each generation left to guess at the truths and wisdom of those who came before. Now, let me take you back to a time more than 5,000 years ago, in the lush, unpredictable land between two mighty rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Here, in the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, something quietly extraordinary began to unfold. People started to press gentle marks into soft, wet clay, not knowing that they were lighting a spark that would change the world forever. These were the first written words in human history, and they were not carved by kings or carved in stone. Instead, they were pressed into humble clay tablets with a simple reed stylus. But why did this all begin? Imagine bustling markets where traders argued about debts and goods, where farmers worried about the harvest and priests tried to remember which offerings had been made to which gods. It was chaos, and memories alone were not enough. People needed a way to keep track of what mattered most. So, with each tiny wedge-shaped mark, the world grew a little more organized, a little less uncertain. The word cuneiform actually comes from the Latin word for wedge. Scribes pressed these little wedges into the clay, line by line, creating a new language that anyone could read, as long as they had the patience to learn the signs. And here's something curious. The very first cuneiform texts were not poems or heroic tales. They were simple receipts, records of bread and beer, because in ancient times, even the gods were said to enjoy a good feast. Over time, this writing system spread far and wide. It was not just the Sumerians who used it. Traders, rulers, and priests from Akkad, Babylon, and even faraway Persia adapted cuneiform to their own languages, each adding their own marks and meanings. Some tablets survived for thousands of years, not because they were treasured, but simply because they were accidentally baked hard in the fires that destroyed the cities around them. And what about the people behind these words? Becoming a scribe was not for the faint of heart. Young students spent years hunched over their clay, memorizing hundreds of signs, copying texts until their hands ached. But for those who succeeded, the rewards were immense. Scribes were the keepers of knowledge, the recorders of history, the ones who could make words last forever. So, today, as we step back into the world where cuneiform was born, let's remember, history did not begin with epic battles or mighty empires. It began with the quiet, careful marks of ordinary people who wanted their stories and their lives to be remembered. If you love history as much as we do, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires to keep exploring the legacy of the ancient world. Picture this. You're a merchant in ancient Mesopotamia, around 3,200 years before Christ. Your warehouse is packed with grain, your customers owe you silver, and your workers need their daily rations of bread and beer. But here's the problem. How do you keep track of it all? Your memory can only hold so much, and one mistake could mean financial ruin. This exact challenge faced the brilliant Sumerians who lived between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. At first, they came up with a clever solution: small clay tokens. Each token represented something specific: a sheep, a jar of oil, a measure of barley. It was like having a three-dimensional accounting system right in your hands. But as their cities grew larger and trade became more complex, even this token system started breaking down. Imagine trying to carry around hundreds of clay pieces every time you went to market. The Sumerians needed something better, something more permanent. Then came one of those breakthrough moments that changed human history forever. Some unknown genius, probably a stressed-out scribe dealing with too many tokens, had a revolutionary idea. Instead of carrying around all these clay pieces, why not just press them into soft clay tablets and create permanent impressions? This simple act sparked something extraordinary. Those pressed token shapes gradually evolved into something we now call pictographs, little drawings that represented real objects. A circle with lines might represent the sun, Wavy lines could mean water, and simple stick figures showed people or animals. But here's where it gets really fascinating. Over time, these scribes discovered something that would transform civilization. They could use these symbols to represent not just objects, but sounds and ideas too. Suddenly, they weren't just recording 10 sheep. They could capture thoughts, stories, laws, and dreams. The tool they used was beautifully simple: a reed stylus cut to create a triangular tip. When pressed into wet clay, it made wedge-shaped marks. That's actually where we get the name cuneiform. It comes from the Latin word cuneus, meaning wedge. Now here's something that might surprise you. The very first cuneiform texts weren't grand epics or royal proclamations. They were receipts and inventory lists. The earliest tablet we've found is essentially an ancient grocery list, recording payments of beer and bread. It seems even our ancestors couldn't escape paperwork. What's truly remarkable is how these simple wedge marks spread across the ancient world like wildfire. The Akkadians adopted it, then the Babylonians, and eventually even the mighty Persian Empire was using cuneiform for official documents. Each culture adapted it to fit their own language, proving just how versatile this writing system really was. Here's one of my favorite historical ironies. Many of these ancient tablets survived to modern times purely by accident. When cities were attacked and burned, the intense heat from the fires actually baked the clay tablets hard as stone, preserving them for thousands of years. The very disasters that destroyed these civilizations ended up saving their stories for us. The people who mastered this new technology, the scribes, became incredibly powerful. Think of them as the computer programmers of the ancient world. Learning cuneiform took years of intense study. Students had to memorize hundreds of different symbols, practice writing for hours each day, and endure strict discipline from their teachers. But those who succeeded gained access to an exclusive club. They became the lawyers, accountants, diplomats, and record keepers of their society. Some scribes even left us glimpses of their personality in their work. Archaeologists have found practice tablets where frustrated students scratched complaints in the margins. "I can't take this anymore," proving that some things never change about school life. As cuneiform matured, it began capturing much more than business transactions. The Babylonians used it to record the world's first known set of laws, Hammurabi's Code. Temple priests wrote prayers and hymns to gods like Enlil and Inanna. Scholars created the first maps, mathematical formulas, and astronomical observations. And then came perhaps the greatest achievement of all, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Written in cuneiform nearly 4,000 years ago, it tells the story of a king's quest for immortality after losing his best friend. The opening lines still give me chills. "He who has seen everything, I will make known to the lands." This wasn't just entertainment. It was humanity's first attempt to grapple with life's biggest questions through literature. Love, friendship, death, the meaning of existence, all captured in those tiny wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay. Cuneiform remained the dominant writing system in the ancient Near East for over 3,000 years. That's longer than Christianity has existed. It witnessed the rise and fall of empires, recorded the deeds of legendary kings like Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus the Great, and preserved the wisdom of countless generations. What amazes me most is how this invention fundamentally changed what it means to be human. Before writing, knowledge died with people. Wisdom could only travel as far as someone could walk and remember. But cuneiform created something new, permanent human memory. Suddenly, a merchant's son could learn accounting from tablets written by his grandfather. A king could issue laws that would outlast his reign. A poet could share stories with people living centuries in the future. We became a species that could build on the knowledge of previous generations, rather than starting from scratch each time. Today, as we send messages instantly around the world and store vast libraries in our pockets, it's worth remembering those ancient scribes hunched over clay tablets by lamplight. They were the ones who first discovered that human thoughts could outlive human lives, that ideas could travel through time, and that tiny marks in clay could change the world forever. The next time you write a text message, send an email, or even scribble a note to yourself. Remember, you're participating in a tradition that began 5,200 years ago in the mud between two rivers, when someone first realized that the human voice could be made permanent with nothing more than a reed and some wet clay. Becoming a scribe wasn't easy. It took years of brutal training. Students memorized hundreds of signs, copied texts endlessly, and faced harsh discipline. But those who mastered cuneiform held immense power. They were the lawyers, accountants, and scholars of their time. Imagine walking through the bustling streets of ancient Babylon around 1,500 years before Christ. Past the merchants hawking spices, beyond the craftsmen hammering bronze, you'd hear something that might surprise you. The sound of children chanting, not playing games or singing songs, but reciting hundreds of mysterious symbols over and over again. These weren't ordinary children. They were the future elite of Mesopotamian society, training to become scribes, the gatekeepers of humanity's most revolutionary technology, writing. Let me tell you what it was really like to become one of these ancient knowledge workers, because their story is both inspiring and heartbreaking in ways you might not expect. Picture a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, whose father has decided his son will join the scribal class. This wasn't a decision made lightly. Scribal training was expensive, demanding, and there was no guarantee of success. But if the boy made it through, he'd have access to power and prestige that most people could only dream of. The first day at scribal school must have been overwhelming. Students entered a world completely different from the fields and workshops where most children learned their trades. Here, they sat in rows on hard benches, each with a lump of fresh clay and a reed stylus, facing years of what could only be described as intellectual boot camp. The challenge was staggering. Cuneiform wasn't like our alphabet with just 26 letters. By the time the system had fully developed, there were over 600 different signs to master. Some represented whole words, others stood for syllables, and many could mean different things depending on context. It was like learning to juggle while solving math problems and reciting poetry all at the same time. Students began with the most basic signs, simple marks for numbers, common objects, everyday words. Hour after hour, day after day, they pressed their styluses into clay, copying the same symbols until their hands cramped and their eyes burned from squinting at tiny wedge marks. But here's what makes their story so human and relatable. These ancient students were just as frustrated, bored, and rebellious as any teenager today. Archaeologists have uncovered practice tablets where exhausted apprentices scribbled complaints in the margins. One particularly fed-up student wrote, "My hand hurts from writing." Another scratched out, "I hate this work." And my personal favorite, one young scribe in training wrote, "I want to go home to my mother." The discipline was strict, sometimes harsh by our standards. Teachers carried switches and weren't afraid to use them on students who made too many mistakes or showed disrespect. One ancient text describes a student's day. The fellow in charge of drawing said, "Why did you speak without permission?" and beat me. The fellow in charge of the gate said, "Why did you go out without permission?" and beat me. But those who persevered discovered something magical happening to their minds. As months turned to years, the symbols that once seemed impossibly complex began to flow naturally from their styluses. They could read the epic tales of heroes and gods, decode legal contracts, and understand the mathematical formulas that governed trade and construction. The advanced students moved beyond copying basic signs to learning different styles of writing. There was the elegant script used for royal proclamations, the quick cursive for everyday business, and the formal style reserved for religious texts. It was like learning calligraphy, shorthand, and typography, all rolled into one demanding art form. What's fascinating is how these scribes developed their own professional culture and inside jokes. Some left tiny signatures or personal marks hidden in their official documents, ancient graffiti that only other scribes would notice and understand. Others included clever wordplay or double meanings that would sail right over the heads of non-literate clients, but would make their scribal colleagues chuckle. The social transformation that came with mastering cuneiform was dramatic. A farmer's son who completed scribal training could suddenly find himself advising kings, managing temple treasuries, or serving as a diplomat between empires. Literacy was their passport to a completely different social class. These scribes became the backbone of ancient civilization in ways that are hard to imagine today. Every business deal, every legal contract, every government decree, every religious ceremony that needed to be recorded, it all flowed through their trained hands. They were simultaneously the lawyers, accountants, secretaries, librarians, and journalists of their time. But perhaps most remarkably, they were also the guardians of human culture. When a scribe sat down to copy an ancient epic or a collection of laws, he wasn't just doing his job, he was ensuring that human knowledge would survive another generation. Every tablet they carefully reproduced was a victory against the forgetting that had plagued humanity since the beginning of time. Some scribes specialized in particular areas. Temple scribes focused on religious texts and maintained the vast libraries attached to major temples. Palace scribes handled government correspondence and royal archives. Commercial scribes worked in the markets, helping merchants with contracts and keeping track of complex trading relationships that might span thousands of miles. The most elite scribes could read and write in multiple languages. Since cuneiform was adapted by many different cultures, a truly skilled scribe might be fluent in Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and even Egyptian hieroglyphs. These polyglot scribes were incredibly valuable for diplomatic missions and international trade negotiations. Here's something that gives me chills when I think about it. Many of these scribes knew they were preserving something precious for the future. Some tablets include colophons, ancient copyright notices, where scribes would write things like, "For the sake of learning and preservation, may this knowledge endure forever." They understood that they were links in a chain of human wisdom stretching both backward and forward through time. The irony is that while scribes held tremendous power during their lifetimes, many of them remain anonymous to us today. We can read their words, admire their skill, and marvel at their achievements. But most of their names are lost to history. They were the invisible architects of civilization, building the foundation upon which all later learning would rest. When you think about it, we're still following in their footsteps today. Every time we save a document, back up our photos, or share knowledge online, we're driven by the same impulse that motivated those ancient scribes, the deeply human desire to make sure that important things don't disappear into the silence of forgotten time. The next time you're struggling to learn something difficult, remember those young scribes hunched over their clay tablets, their hands aching, their eyes tired, but their minds slowly mastering one of humanity's greatest inventions. They remind us that some achievements are worth the struggle, especially when they help preserve and share the best of what it means to be human. Are you fascinated by this ancient legacy? Then comment your thoughts, like the video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more epic journeys. Something extraordinary happened to cuneiform writing around 2,000 years before Christ. What had begun as a practical tool for counting sheep and recording grain deliveries suddenly blossomed into something far more profound, humanity's first attempt to capture the deepest mysteries of existence in permanent form. Picture the moment when a scribe first realized that these wedge-shaped marks could do more than track business transactions. They could preserve the whispered prayers of a mother hoping for her child's recovery, the solemn words of a judge pronouncing justice, or the thrilling adventures of legendary heroes. Cuneiform was about to become the vessel for humanity's soul. Let me take you on a journey through the most remarkable texts ever pressed into clay, because these aren't just ancient artifacts. They're intimate conversations with people who lived thousands of years ago but worried about the exact same things we do today. Around 1750 years before Christ, King Hammurabi of Babylon commissioned something that had never existed before: a comprehensive written law code that would apply to everyone in his kingdom, from the wealthiest merchant to the humblest farmer. Imagine being a citizen in ancient Babylon when these laws were first announced. For the first time in human history, you could know exactly what would happen if someone stole your property, injured your family, or broke a contract with you. Justice was no longer just the whim of whoever happened to be in power. It was written in stone, literally. The Code of Hammurabi contained 282 laws covering everything from marriage disputes to building regulations. What's fascinating is how surprisingly modern some of these laws feel. There were regulations about medical malpractice. If a surgeon caused harm through negligence, he would face specific penalties. There were consumer protection laws ensuring that builders who constructed unsafe houses would be held responsible for any damage. But here's what really gets me. Hammurabi didn't just create these laws and forget about them. He had them carved on massive stone pillars and placed in public squares throughout his empire. This wasn't just about creating rules. It was about creating trust. Citizens could walk up to these pillars, have a scribe read the laws aloud, and know exactly where they stood. The prologue to Hammurabi's code, written in beautiful cuneiform script, reveals something touching about this ancient king's motivations. He wrote that the gods had chosen him to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak. But cuneiform captured more than legal proceedings. It preserved the intimate conversations between humans and their gods. Ancient Mesopotamians believed their deities were deeply involved in daily life, and they poured their hearts out in prayers that feel remarkably familiar even today. Temple scribes recorded thousands of these prayers and hymns. Some were joyful celebrations of harvest festivals or military victories. Others were desperate pleas during times of plague, famine, or war. Reading them today, you can almost hear the trembling voices of people facing the same fears and hopes that move us now. One prayer to the goddess Inanna begins, "My lady, the magnificent one among the gods, my queen who roams through all the lands." Another, addressed to the god Enlil during a time of crisis, pleads, "Turn your face toward me, have pity on me, accept my prayers." What strikes me most about these religious texts is how honest they are about human struggles. These weren't perfect people presenting themselves as flawless to their gods. They wrote about their mistakes, their doubts, their anger, and their desperate need for divine help. It's the same raw honesty you might find in someone's private diary today. And then came the masterpiece, the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's first great work of literature. Written around 4,000 years ago, this story has everything: friendship, adventure, loss, and the ultimate quest that drives every human heart. The search for meaning in the face of mortality. The story begins with Gilgamesh, the powerful king of Uruk, who is essentially having what we might call a midlife crisis. He's achieved everything a person could want: wealth, power, fame. But he's restless and often cruel to his subjects. The gods decide he needs a true friend to humble him, so they create Enkidu, a wild man who lives among the animals. When these two finally meet, they fight an epic battle that ends in mutual respect and deep friendship. It's one of literature's first great buddy stories, and the bond between Gilgamesh and Enkidu feels as real and moving as any friendship portrayed in modern films or novels. But here's where the story becomes profound in ways that still take my breath away. Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh is devastated. He's never truly faced the reality of death before, and now he's confronted with the terrible knowledge that he too will someday die and be forgotten. This realization launches Gilgamesh on a desperate quest to find immortality. He travels to the ends of the earth, faces monsters, crosses the waters of death, and finally meets Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood. Yes, this epic includes a flood story that predates the biblical account by centuries. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh about a plant that grants eternal youth. Gilgamesh finds this magical plant at the bottom of the sea, but just as he's about to return home triumphant, a serpent steals it while he's bathing. He returns to Uruk empty-handed, but somehow wiser. The ending is what makes this story so powerful and so modern. Gilgamesh doesn't achieve immortality, but he learns something perhaps more valuable, that meaning comes not from living forever, but from the love we share, the friendships we build, and the legacy we leave behind. What amazes me most about these cuneiform texts is how they shatter our assumptions about ancient people. We sometimes imagine our ancestors as somehow less sophisticated, less emotionally complex than we are. But these writings reveal minds grappling with the same fundamental questions that keep us awake at night. The scribes who carefully pressed these stories into clay weren't just recording words. They were preserving the human experience in all its complexity. They captured the rage of kings, the tenderness of lovers, the wisdom of judges, and the desperation of people facing loss. Some tablets contain what we might recognize as the first recorded jokes. Others include love letters that could have been written yesterday. There are angry complaints about shoddy workmanship, proud announcements of children's achievements, and heartbreaking eulogies for beloved family members. One of my favorite examples is a letter from a merchant's wife to her husband, written around 4,000 years ago. She scolds him for staying away too long on a business trip and demands that he send her some fine wool for a dress. The tone is so familiar, so recognizably human, that you can almost hear her voice across the centuries. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about these literary and legal texts is that they were deliberately preserved in vast libraries. The most famous was the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, which contained over 30,000 cuneiform tablets covering every subject imaginable: literature, science, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and history. King Ashurbanipal, who ruled in the 7th century before Christ, was perhaps history's first great bibliophile. He sent scribes throughout his empire to collect and copy important texts, creating what was essentially the world's first systematic effort to preserve human knowledge. The scribes in these libraries weren't just copyists. They were editors, translators, and scholars. They created the first catalogs, organized texts by subject, and even wrote what we might recognize as the first book reviews. Some tablets include notes like, "This is a good copy," or "This version differs from the one found in Babylon." When you realize that these ancient librarians were working to ensure that important stories and ideas would survive for future generations, it becomes incredibly moving. Every tablet they carefully copied was a vote of confidence in the future, a belief that knowledge was worth preserving even if they couldn't know who might eventually read it. Today, when we worry about preserving digital information or keeping important cultural works alive, we're following in the footsteps of those ancient scribes who understood that some things are too precious to let slip away into the silence of forgotten time. They gave us the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Code of Hammurabi, and thousands of other texts that continue to speak to the human condition across more than 4,000 years. The next time you read a story that moves you, remember that it all started with someone pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay, trying to capture something essential about what it means to be human. Those ancient scribes succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Their words are still alive, still speaking to us, still reminding us that the deepest human experiences transcend time, culture, and the fragile clay that first preserved them. Let me leave you with a thought that still gives me chills every time I consider it. Right now, as you listen to these words, you're participating in a miracle that began 5,200 years ago in the muddy banks of ancient Mesopotamia. Every letter you read, every message you send, every story that moves you, all of it traces back to that first moment when someone pressed a reed into wet clay and realized they could make thoughts permanent. Think about this for a moment. Before cuneiform, every human who ever lived faced the same terrible limitation. When they died, their knowledge died with them. A master craftsman could spend decades perfecting his techniques, but unless he could pass them on through direct demonstration to an apprentice, all that wisdom would vanish forever. A wise ruler's insights about leadership and justice would disappear the moment his voice fell silent. Epic stories that had taken generations to perfect could be lost forever if just one storyteller forgot a crucial detail. But cuneiform changed everything. Suddenly, human knowledge became immortal. Imagine trying to explain our modern world to someone who lived before writing existed. How could you describe a university where students learn from books written by people who died centuries ago. How would you explain the concept of laws that remain consistent across vast distances and long periods of time? How could you convey the idea of scientific progress, where each generation builds upon discoveries made by previous researchers they never met? These concepts would be almost impossible to grasp for someone living in a purely oral culture because writing didn't just record. Civilization. It created the very possibility of civilization as we know it. Here's something that amazes me. Those ancient Sumerian merchants who started using clay tokens to track their sheep and grain had no idea they were launching a revolution that would fundamentally change what it means to be human. They were just trying to solve a practical problem: how to keep accurate records in an increasingly complex economy. But their simple solution opened a door that humanity has been walking through ever since. Cuneiform became the foundation for everything that followed. The Phoenician alphabet that eventually evolved into our modern letters, it grew from principles first established in those wedge-shaped marks. The great libraries of Alexandria and Baghdad, they were built on organizational systems pioneered by Mesopotamian scribes. Even our modern concepts of contracts, legal precedent, and historical documentation, all of these trace their roots back to cuneiform tablets. But perhaps the most profound impact of cuneiform wasn't practical. It was psychological. For the first time in human history, people could have conversations with the dead. A young scribe could read the thoughts of someone who had lived generations before him. A king could issue commands that would outlast his own lifetime. A poet could share emotions with readers living centuries in the future. This created something entirely new in human experience: the sense that individual lives could have meaning beyond their biological span. When the author of the Epic of Gilgamesh wrote about the hero's quest for immortality, he was unknowingly achieving a form of immortality himself. We're still reading his words, still moved by his insights, still wrestling with the same questions he posed about love, death, and the search for meaning. The scribes who painstakingly copied these texts understood this profound responsibility. Many tablets include what we might recognize as the first copyright notices, where scribes would write prayers asking that their work be preserved for future generations. They knew they were creating something precious, a bridge across time that would allow human wisdom to accumulate rather than constantly disappear. Here's a mind-bending fact. We know more about daily life in ancient Babylon than we do about daily life in medieval Europe, simply because the Babylonians wrote everything down on durable clay tablets, while many medieval documents were written on perishable parchment. Those ancient scribes accidentally created a time capsule that has given us an incredibly detailed picture of their world. The impact of cuneiform extended far beyond Mesopotamia. When other cultures saw what writing could accomplish, they raced to develop their own systems. Egyptian hieroglyphs, Chinese characters, Mayan glyphs, all of these emerged in civilizations that had either direct or indirect contact with the literate societies of the ancient Near East. Writing spread across the world like a beneficial infection, transforming every culture it touched. But let's pause for a moment and imagine the alternative. What if writing had never been invented? What would our world look like today? Without writing, we'd still be trapped in the same cycle that limited our ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years. Each generation would have to rediscover everything from scratch. There would be no accumulation of scientific knowledge, no preservation of cultural wisdom, no way to coordinate complex societies across vast distances or long periods of time. We might never have developed mathematics beyond basic counting, because complex mathematical concepts require notation systems to flourish. We probably wouldn't have created sophisticated legal systems, because justice depends on consistent application of established principles. Art and literature would be limited to what could be memorized and passed down orally, meaning we'd lose the subtle complexity that comes from being able to revise and refine written works. Most fundamentally, we would lack the sense of historical continuity that shapes how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. We are who we are today partly because we can read the thoughts of Plato, learn from the mistakes documented by ancient historians, and build upon scientific discoveries made by researchers who died long before we were born. Every time you look up information online, save a document to your computer or send a message that will be read later, you're participating in the same basic human impulse that drove those first scribes to press marks into clay. We're all part of an unbroken chain of people who believed that some thoughts, some discoveries, some emotions are too valuable to let disappear into the silence of forgetting. The story of cuneiform is ultimately the story of humanity's refusal to accept the limitations of individual mortality. Those ancient Mesopotamians looked at the temporary nature of human life and said, "We can do better than this. We can make our thoughts outlast our bodies. We can speak to people we'll never meet, in times we'll never see." And they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Right now, more than 5,000 years later, we're still listening to their voices, still learning from their wisdom, still marveling at their ingenuity. The wedge-shaped marks they pressed into clay became the foundation for every book ever written, every law ever codified, every scientific paper ever published. When archaeologists first deciphered cuneiform in the 19th century, they weren't just uncovering ancient artifacts, they were reuniting humanity with its own earliest recorded thoughts. Suddenly, we could hear the actual words of people who had lived when the pyramids were still under construction, when Stonehenge was being built, when the first cities were rising from agricultural villages. These ancient voices remind us that the fundamental human experiences, love, loss, hope, fear, the search for justice and meaning, remain constant across millennia. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia prove that we share more with our ancient ancestors than we often realize. They worried about their children, struggled with unfair treatment, celebrated achievements, and tried to make sense of an often confusing and dangerous world. Perhaps most importantly, they believed in the future. Every tablet they created, every story they preserved, every law they recorded was an act of faith that someone someday would find value in their words. They were right to believe in us, just as we must believe in the generations who will inherit whatever wisdom we manage to preserve. The next time you write something down, whether it's a shopping list, a text message, or a heartfelt letter, remember that you're participating in humanity's greatest invention. You're adding your voice to a conversation that began in ancient Mesopotamia and will continue long after all of us are gone. The echoes of cuneiform surround us still, in every alphabet, every library, every saved file on every computer in the world. Those first scribes who learned to make clay speak couldn't have imagined smartphones or the internet, but they created the conceptual foundation that made all of it possible. Their greatest gift to us wasn't any particular text or law or story, as wonderful as many of those are. Their greatest gift was the revolutionary idea that human knowledge doesn't have to die with the humans who create it, that we can be partners with people across vast stretches of time, building something together that none of us could accomplish alone. That partnership continues today, and it will continue tomorrow, because once humanity learned to make marks that could outlast the makers, we became something new, a species that could truly learn from its past and consciously shape its future. All because someone, somewhere, 5,000 years ago, picked up a reed stylus and decided to press it into clay. What lessons can we draw from this ancient tradition? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more untold stories of the ancient world.